Boris Johnson reported to the police again over new claims of breaking lockdown rules. It happened after the Cabinet Office was alerted to notes in the former PM's official diaries, allegedly about visits by friends to his country retreat at Chequers during the pandemic. Mr Johnson had submitted the records in preparation for the COVID inquiry.
We see the Conservatives being haunted by this disgraced former Prime Minister, and really it's time that the country turned a corner on 13 years of Conservative sleaze.
Mr Johnson, already under investigation by the Privileges Committee over Partygate, of course, has denied breaking the rules in these latest allegations. Carl and Paul have all the details. Also on News at 10 tonight. What exactly happened on the Cardiff estate where 2 teenagers died last night? CCTV footage appears to contradict the police's original line. An upgrade for the UK economy's prospects from the IMF, but a warning over stubborn inflation.
Sometimes I have operated on a soldier who should really have no chance to live, but somehow they survive.
On Ukraine's medical frontline, John is in a field hospital near Bakhmut, where victory is keeping wounded soldiers alive and putting female artists in the frame. The rehang at Tate Britain trying to redress the imbalance of history.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. Boris Johnson's controversial relationship with the lockdown rules he himself imposed during the pandemic has come back to haunt him again tonight. It's emerged the former Prime Minister has been reported to police by the Cabinet Office over new claims he may have broken the rules. The details were in his own official diaries, which he himself handed over to the COVID inquiry. They include visits to Chequers by friends of Mr Johnson between June 2020 and May 2021. Mr Johnson's office says he's been advised by lawyers that the events in question were lawful and broke no restrictions. The Cabinet Office says the information was passed on in line with established procedures.
Boris Johnson is in Texas this week, shoring up Republican support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, his government-funded lawyers have been preparing his case for the forthcoming COVID inquiry. During that work, they found entries in his diary relating to visitors to Chequers during lockdown. They informed the Cabinet Office, who in turn told Buckinghamshire Police. And it's not just Chequers. The Metropolitan Police say they are also assessing new information about potential breaches of lockdown rules here in Downing Street. The Cabinet Office say the information was passed to the police as a matter of course. No ministers were involved in the decision, but Boris Johnson's team believe it is clearly politically motivated. His spokesperson said no contact was made with Mr Johnson before these incorrect allegations were made. This is both bizarre and unacceptable. The events in question were all within the rules, either because they were held outdoors or came within another lawful exception. They include regular meetings with civil servants and advisers. Opposition parties say they've heard it all before.
Quite frankly, Boris Johnson's had the opportunity to tell the truth time and time and time again. I think it's now time for him to reflect on everything that he's done in politics in the last few years and to consider his position as an MP.
It's wrong that the taxpayer is still picking up the bill for Boris Johnson's legal defence fund, and Rishi Sunak should put an end to it immediately. And Boris Johnson will have to explain himself now to the authorities once again.
And it is the case that before the police fined him and 82 other people for breaking his own rules in Downing Street, he had said this.
All guidance was followed completely during number 10.
For those bereaved by COVID, any reminder of the Partygate events is deeply painful.
Angry is a euphemism for how I feel, because it's such a deep sense of betrayal that, for me personally, the day after I buried my father, there was a party. How can you hold those two realities together and say that the Prime Minister did everything he could to protect us?
Boris Johnson is still under investigation for what he said to Parliament about the parties which undermined his premiership, but his team say the information sent to the police in the last few days is not the subject of any formal investigation. Carl Denny, News at 10, Westminster.
And Paul, our UK editor, is here. And as Carl was saying there, he's already under investigation. He's no longer Prime Minister, Paul. What does this actually add to the picture that we're already aware of?
Well, Julia, we don't need a police investigation to establish whether or not Boris Johnson broke the law during lockdown. We've already had one, and he did, along with 82 of his colleagues. So I don't think whether or not the Met and Thames Valley Police decide to investigate these latest allegations or not is going to fundamentally sort of alter the broad shape of his political legacy. But it does influence the parliamentary police, if you like, the Privileges Committee that looks at the conduct of MPs. And we've heard there from Carl a reminder that they are, of course, looking at whether he misled MPs when he said that no rules were broken. I'm told tonight that the Privileges Committee have had this evidence since last week. They are taking it into consideration as they try to reach their conclusions. Perhaps this may delay their conclusions. There was a chance that they would report back as soon as next month. Boris Johnson, though, as we've heard, is vociferous tonight in claiming that this is all a load of old rubbish, quite frankly, that it's politically motivated rubbish, worse than that. Though if you look at the chain of communication here and really scrutinise what he's saying, this is lawyers reporting it to civil servants who reported it to the police. There's no obvious political process there, as far as I can see it, where that political interference could be injected into the whole narrative. But nevertheless, he feels quite aggrieved over all of this. What's interesting, though, is that very few of his supporters are being vocal tonight too. So very few are in the media, very few are tweeting away angrily as they did just as soon as last autumn, when it looked like there was a real chance of a Boris Johnson comeback. And I think that is a sign of how far his political stock has fallen in that short period of time. And perhaps that is the bigger problem tonight for Boris Johnson, rather than the specifics of these allegations. OK, Paul, thank you very much. It is thankfully peaceful on the streets of an estate in Cardiff tonight, which was the scene of serious disturbances 24 hours ago. There are still questions and anger among residents over the deaths of 2 teenage boys killed in a serious collision while riding an electric bike. This morning, the police had suggested officers only arrived at the scene afterwards, but later this afternoon, footage emerged from a street nearby showing a bike followed closely by a police van. Tonight, South Wales Police say they are investigating, as too is the police watchdog.
Police under attack on the streets of Cardiff. Terrified residents cowered indoors as fireworks, bricks and paving slabs were hurled at riot police. 15 officers were injured, with 11 needing hospital treatment as this quiet residential street turned into a battleground. As shell-shocked residents dealt with their smouldering street, there were tributes at the source of the disorder, a crash in which 16-year-old Kyrie Sullivan and 15-year-old Harvey Evans died. Rumours circulated they'd been killed in a police chase. This morning, South Wales Police said officers were called after the crash, while the area's Police and Crime Commissioner categorically denied any chase took place. But this afternoon, footage taken minutes before the incident emerged, showing 2 people on a bike being followed by a police van.
We've received CCTV footage that shows a police vehicle following a bike at just prior to 6 p.m. This footage is being recovered as part of the investigation and will assist us in piecing together the circumstances leading up to the collision. We can confirm that the following investigations have been carried out so far, and when the collision occurred, there were no police vehicles on Snowdon Road.
Why were we not told that this morning? There was Chief Superintendent.
Many questions remain unanswered. As the riot escalated, the mother of one of the dead teenagers pleaded for the crowd to disperse so she could go to her son's side. He and his best friend were left lying in the road for hours, the emergency services unable to move them. As the clear-up continued today, some residents were concerned there would be more disorder tonight.
Honestly, my wife, as you can see, my little boy, I mean, everybody was shocked. Everybody was shocked, you know. Hope it doesn't happen.
Ely is one of the poorest communities in Wales, but the local vicar tells me unrest of this kind is extremely rare.
You know, the majority of people here are wonderful, and this small minority have caused this disturbance last night. Absolutely shocking, you know, and all on the back of that poor accident, that tragedy, you know, those poor boys being killed.
South Wales Police has this evening referred itself to the police watchdog while investigations continue into exactly what happened. Here in Ely, tensions remain high. Rhys Williams, News at 10, Cardiff.
The government seemed pretty happy tonight with the International Monetary Fund's latest assessment of the UK economy. According to the IMF, the UK should avoid recession this year, and instead of the economy shrinking, it's now forecast to grow by a small amount. What's more, the UK should outperform Germany. The Chancellor says this clearly indicates government policies are working, but scratch the surface, and the news remains pretty bleak for households in the grip of the cost of living crisis, with little prospect of a let-up in the financial squeeze anytime soon.
Our economic prospects look a little brighter. That's the view of the IMF. That's the view here in Leicester too. This business still feels bruised by high energy bills and Brexit. But in the last few months, orders for woolen jumpers have started to pick up again.
The outlook is good. Now we're going into what we call our autumn-winter season. We are getting a lot more inquiries, and a lot of those will turn into actual production runs.
The IMF now thinks the UK will escape a recession this year. The fund's managing director praised the Chancellor's economic policies today, insisting they will raise growth eventually. But she warned it may be a few years before we start feeling better off again.
We are talking about the medium term. Over the next years, 2025, 26, 27, we are seeing these improvements paying back to the British people.
Back in January, the IMF thought the UK would be the worst performing major economy this year, contracting by 0.6%. Last month, the IMF upgraded its forecast. Today, it did so again. The IMF now thinks the UK economy will grow slightly. We are still expected to be near the bottom of the G7 growth table this year, but the head of the IMF described the UK's performance over the last 2 years as pretty good compared with these other countries. The sting in the tail is inflation, currently 10% in the UK, which the IMF says is stubbornly high. The headline rate is expected to fall, but only to 5% by the end of this year. The Bank of England, of course, has already hiked interest rates by almost 4.5% in the space of the last year and a half. The IMF warns further hikes are likely to be necessary.
What is most concerning is food prices being the toughest to bring down. Not just in the UK, this is everywhere. It does mean that interest rates will have to remain higher for longer.
The latest evidence suggests that food prices are still increasing at an annual rate of 17%. There are, though, reasons to hope that food inflation has peaked, and the government insists we're on the right path.
What we've heard is a decisive vote of confidence in UK economic management, but we also hear the warnings about global instability and risk, and I want to reassure you that we will stick to our plan to keep inflation down and halve it.
Back in Leicester, and while there's hope that the worst may indeed be over, the road back to prosperity feels long and unpredictable. Next Christmas may not feel much happier than the last one.
So, Joel, the Chancellor's looking pretty chipper there, really. But worth thinking about the pledges which the Prime Minister has set out for the end of the year, 5 of them, 3 of which are on the economy, 1 halving inflation, getting debt falling, and also growing economy. Where does this assessment sit alongside what he's aiming to achieve by the end of this year?
Well, if the IMF is right, inflation will be halved by the end of the year, but will still be quite painfully high. National debt will stabilise as a share of national income, but there are no room for tax cuts. And growth will pick up eventually, but a lot of people aren't going to feel much of a difference for quite some time. The Chancellor was happy today. You could feel it when he was on the stage. And no wonder, look at the narrative that's emerged around the IMF. They've been really downbeat of late about the UK, its prospects relative to other countries. That narrative does seem to have changed. They think our prospects, our fortunes have improved. Yes, because pay growth is stronger. Yes, because energy prices have fallen. But also, get this, because of government policy. There was warm applause from the IMF today for the childcare funding announcements in the budget, for capital allowances for businesses, for the Windsor framework agreed between the UK and the EU back in February. All of these things, the IMF says, will lift growth. Note, though, it hasn't revised its estimate of the damage, the economic damage that Brexit will cause. That remains between 2 and 6% of GDP. The thing that will concern the Chancellor, though, is the IMF's view that very few people are going to be feeling much better off come the next general election. He's under enormous pressure from his own MPs, of course, to cut taxes. The IMF's assessment is there's no room for fiscal loosening this year or next. And if money suddenly falls into the Chancellor's lap unexpectedly, he should bank it, not spend it.
OK, Joel, thank you very much for all of that. Thank you. A rows blown up tonight over new immigration rules announced by the government 2 days before official figures are expected to show net migration running at record levels. Under the measures, most overseas students will now be unable to get visas for their families and dependents. Opponents claim this could hit universities which rely heavily on foreign student fees.
When Barbara Jika came to Britain from Nigeria to study a master's, she brought her 10- and 8-year-old sons.
I don't think I would have come. There's no way I would have left my 2 boys. Absolutely not. My wanting to further my education, to get a better job, was all because it was for them.
She says graduating with that master's led her to come back for a PhD and to work as a healthcare assistant in the NHS. Under new rules, international students like Barbara will no longer be able to bring dependents to the UK unless they're on a postgraduate research course. It comes after the number of family members arriving with students rose 8-fold to almost 136,000. International students are part of overall net migration figures that are expected to hit record levels on Thursday, crossing 700,000. The issue, which was discussed at Cabinet this morning, has divided members.
Are you failing on immigration targets, Home Secretary?
The Home Secretary had wanted to go further and faster on cutting migration. But were her ambitions curtailed by other colleagues pushing in a different direction? This Tory MP said the Home Office had previously wanted to cut a 2-year work visa available to students after their course and even put a cap on overall numbers.
And that hasn't happened. What we've seen today is actually very reasonable reforms on dependents. And I think when you look at the battle that's gone on in government, the Education Secretary Gillian Keegan, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt have won against the Home Office in demonstrating the economic opportunity that students can bring.
He argued that students weren't migrants and shouldn't be included in the net figures. Other MPs told ITV News they were furious the government hadn't gone further, but some felt this was a good start.
Legal migration, people who are coming here. It's not all negative, but for many, this is the elephant in the room, really. We want PhD students, we want the world's best, but what we don't want is people doing Mickey Mouse courses as a way of a backdoor into our immigration system.
But universities said this policy would hurt and make it harder for them to compete to attract students. Anushka Astana, News at 10.
The death was announced today of the disgraced former TV entertainer and convicted child sex offender Rolf Harris. Harris, who was 93, was a family favourite before being convicted in 2014 of a string of indecent assaults. These included 2 girls in their early teens and a catalogue of abuse against a friend of his own daughter. His death certificate states he died of neck cancer and old age. Police today began their search of a reservoir just 30 miles from the resort where Madeleine McCann went missing 16 years ago. Throughout the day, officers from Portugal and Germany combed the reservoir's banks. British police were also in attendance. It's believed the prime suspect in the case, convicted German sex offender Christian Bruckner, knew the area well.
16 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared, the global search for her has once again returned to the Portuguese countryside. A 3-nation coalition winding its way along dirt tracks to the shore of a beautiful, if remote, reservoir. Could that remoteness have offered the isolation needed to protect whoever snatched her from her bed all those years ago?
That
is the belief of this man, the German prosecutor holding Christian Bruckner, the convicted sex offender he believes is responsible for Madeleine's abduction and murder. His officers are now in Portugal to guide the search. They came as a result of tip-offs and investigation. Why exactly to this spot? That shall remain our secret for the moment, he says. The search teams are working in an area Bruckner used to visit. The Irade Dam is 40 minutes from where Madeleine disappeared, and phone records put him close to her holiday apartment around the time she vanished. All these years on, The hope is this land may yet offer up any secrets of the past contained here. This isn't the first search of this area. In 2008, an independent search was commissioned by a solicitor. He'd been told that Madeleine's body had been hidden here. The police dismissed it, and it was eventually abandoned due to a lack of money. Telma Fernandez was part of that search. Why are they doing this now, she says. Now, all these years have passed, it's much more difficult. They should have helped us back then. The McCann investigation has faced so many challenges over the years. Today, they had perfect conditions for carrying out the first of their searches. Unfortunately, this evening the heavens opened and they had to stop work earlier than they planned. They'll be hoping for a change in this weather so they can continue tomorrow. The search for Madeleine McCann has been littered with false leads and false hope. That this operation is taking place at all is testament at least to the enduring wish to know what happened to her. Emma Murphy, News at 10, in the Algarve.
And you can see a run-through of the key events in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann on our streaming service, ITVX. Just scroll down to the news section there. A High Court judge today rejected Prince Harry's claim that he should be able to pay for police protection when visiting the UK. The Duke of Sussex wanted to mount a court challenge to the Home Office's refusal to allow him to pay privately for state security arrangements. But the government's lawyer argued that hiring police officers as private bodyguards for the wealthy was not appropriate. The judge said allowing such a move could be seen as unfair. Moscow said it has killed more than 70 armed attackers who launched raids into Russian territory near the border with Ukraine today. The Kremlin claims the attackers were all Ukrainian, crossing the border to hit targets in the Belgorod region before being pushed back. Kyiv denies any involvement, claiming the attack was mounted by Russian partisan fighters opposed to Vladimir Putin's regime. It's being seen as one of the most serious border incidents since the Russian invasion began in February 2022. Meanwhile, the appalling bloodshed continues in and around the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut under relentless attack from Russian forces. With the city now almost completely destroyed, casualties are heavy, and on the Ukrainian front line, a makeshift field hospital does what it can to treat the wounded. John has witnessed how the medics there are engaged in a battle of a different kind, braving the shell fire to try to save lives. His report spares no detail of their extraordinary work.
Its location is secret, because in the battle for Bakhmut, even this medical post is under fire. A fragile haven of humanity amid carnage. We watch as doctors fight to save a soldier. Half his face has been ripped away by shrapnel. All you have to do is breathe, says a doctor. He tells him, if you panic, you're dead. There are more casualties than ever, sometimes too many to treat at once.
You know, I am a doctor. I am not God.
This is Kaplia, one of Ukraine's top trauma specialists, who leads a team of frontline medics.
Sometimes I have operated on a soldier who should really have no chance to live, but somehow they survive. That inspires me.
The soldier's name is Anatoly. He's 31 years old, and for a while, his fate seems to hang in the balance. As shells begin to land, so too does the safety of the medical unit. Ukraine's artillery, close by, fires back. Members of the team were injured when a Russian rocket landed outside the door. Dmitry says it's a constant danger.
Back and forth, yeah? You fire, Russians fire.
Ukraine does not reveal the number of its soldiers killed and injured, but the discarded, bloodied uniforms reflect the intensity of fighting in Bakhmut. This commander tells me that in the city his unit has been bombarded for 3 hours non-stop. One of his men lies on the treatment table. A shell exploded beneath him. He cannot move his legs.
When you witness scenes like this, it's impossible not to think about the bloodshed, the sacrifice, and the loss of life. But for these medics, I suppose the operating table itself is a kind of battlefield with its own defeats and victories.
The paramedics here risk their own lives, ranging across the battlefield to save others.
Why do you do this?
Because it's my country. That's
It's your
all.
country?
Yes, it's my country. I would like that this country, my country, stay on the map of the world.
As for Anatoly, his condition is now stable.
Will he be okay? Will he be okay?
Yeah, I feel good.
You feel good?
Yeah.
Good.
He's taken to a hospital, safe from the front line, alive. But he will bear the scars of Bakhmut forever. John Ray, News at 10, Eastern Ukraine.
The streaming giant Netflix today began its much-anticipated crackdown on the practice of password sharing in the UK and the US. It means that customers who want to share their account with friends or family who live elsewhere will have to pay an extra supplement. In Britain, that'll be $4.99 a month. Netflix says the move is principally aimed at creating extra subscribers, but there's evidence from some countries where the scheme's been tested it may have the opposite effect. Finally, as one of our greatest art galleries, Tate Britain aims to chart the history of the country through the works of our greatest artists, works by the likes of Turner, painting a picture of our nation's past. Until now, though, Britain's rich diversity has been somewhat lacking, and that's being changed with a major rehang at the gallery. Among the pieces now on view is a 1907 painting by Sylvia Pankhurst, a striking abstract by Rachel Jones, also displayed, alongside this painting by Marianne Stokes. And there's also an untitled sculpture by former Turner Prize winner Rachel Whiteread. But the move to redress Tate Britain's gender balance is not without its critics.
A rehang is a chance to re-evaluate, reposition and re-inspire. It's a decade since the Tate Britain last gave its whole collection a shake-up. The new 800-strong display starts way back in the 1500s and goes right up to today, with a greater emphasis on showcasing female artists from both the past and the present.
We've seen fewer artists on display, largely because they were excluded and marginalised from mainstream professional education for artists. So it wasn't until the late 19th century, the early 20th century, that female artists started to be taken seriously, started to become accepted into the societies and the schools for art.
This portrait of an unknown woman is by Joan Carlyle, the first professional female artist in Britain, who was working in 1650. And in another room, the famous works of David Hockney and Peter Blake, now alongside Pauline Boty. Though the major refresh hasn't been without its critics, artist Lydia, whose oil barrels are one of the new commissions, backs the improved gender equality.
It's an important step that institutions are taking to represent more women in their collections and in their exhibitions. Historically, there's been a lot more male artists represented in galleries and institutions.
Across the arts, historic gender imbalances are being redressed. The Proms has promised a 50-50 male-female split in its lineups, and the National Theatre has set itself targets to improve the diversity of both its actors and writers. For the Tate, accurately reflecting 500 years of British history through art is the best way to keep people coming through the doors.
You know, there's something around the physicality of art, of us being with it, of us being able to move around it in real space, and also to be with others seeing it, that I think is just a wonderful experience you cannot substitute only with art on screen. I mean, we show art on screen, so that's a big part of what artists do these days. But, you know, in that sense, I feel very hopeful.
The collection is more than just an assortment of pieces. Each corridor, a visual retelling of history. Rishi Davda, News at 10.
And that's it for tonight from me and all the team here. Good night. We will see you tomorrow.